Welcome to Equipped in Grace, where we talk about following Jesus in the chaos of real life. I'm Vinny Pizarski, and if you've ever wondered how to bring your Sunday faith into your Monday meetings, your parenting, your relationships, or just your everyday mess, then this podcast is for you. So let's get outside of the church pew and get equipped for discipleship in the wild world in which we live. On today's episode, we're going to be joined by Amy and Jeff Chalfin. Jeff and Amy are both very involved here at Grace Church and have been instrumental in helping us to craft our written church devotional, which compiles testimonies and stories from the regular everyday folks who attend here. We'll dive into the importance of sharing our stories with one another a little later on, but first, I wanted to dive into part of Amy and Jeff's story that I read in our most recent devotional. Before they met, they both attended separate churches where they were very well known and very deeply involved. Yet, they both felt God was pushing them out of their respective communities. Now, back in episode 4, we discussed how the Holy Spirit often talks to us or nudges or prompts us with a still, small voice. Thus, the word push really stuck out to me. So let's dive into the conversation right there. Jeff and Amy, describe for us that season of life and how God pushed you into something new.
I would say the story, Vinny, is ironic, but with God, it's not ironic, right? The push part happened for me and Amy kind of at the same time. We were in lifelong churches, right? I grew up in a United Methodist church. I've been there my entire life. As you said, everybody knew me and everything about me, probably more than I knew myself. I don't know. And I there was on the council. I was the youth director for 20 years. And at the end of 20 years, I just felt like it was time to be done with that, right? There was nobody to follow me, but it was time to be done. It was time to be done on council. It was time to pull away from some of that stuff. And so I did. Even at the time, I didn't know why. I didn't understand it, right? Church was my whole life. As a single guy, that's what I did. I did church, right? I spent my time there. My talent. I often joked at my old church that they needed to add on a bedroom so I could just sleep there instead of going home at night. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. I've gotten that when I worked at this church.
Yeah, for sure. So Amy and I have been married just a little over 10 years. And that was in the 2 years prior to meeting Amy. Right. So this happened for me, really before Amy and I met. And I think, Amy, you can explain your similar experience at the same time.
Yeah, it was interesting when we met. If you could like do a life resume, we were kind of the same. Like I'd been in charge of every single ministry, church president, your council president, and the same thing happened to me. God was like, no, I want you to pull away from this. I want you to not be here to do this. And a mantra that I had heard at the time too was, there's a lot of things you can do, but there aren't a lot of things that I want you to do right now. Ooh. Which was very painful because I'm a doer. I had 2 children that I was raising alone, and the church that I grew up in helped raise my kids with me. I mean, I couldn't have done it without them. Right. So an incredible family. I mean, is all you could say. When I met Jeff, I'd been divorced 15 years. And so church and my family was pretty much everything, and work. Right. But yeah, God just kind of started taking us out of, so that by the time we met, we weren't committed in our churches to really anything other than worshiping and doing, small groups and that kind of stuff.
Sure. So you're both very much like ingrained part of the church family, part of the church body, not just.
And I grew up Lutheran. Not that matters, but it's a little different.
Right.
Vocabulary.
So you both were feeling the push to kind of walk away. Was that prior to your meeting or? Okay. So prior.
It was prior to the meeting. Yeah. So this happened for me, like I said, about 2 years before I met Amy, that it started. Right. Mm-hmm. And then I rolled off of council and decided to stop being the youth leader there. And I didn't know why. Right. I just knew it was the thing that I was supposed to do, but I didn't know why. And I was at odds, to be honest, right? Because I was in a spot where I didn't know what to do with myself then. So the thing that I spent most of my outside of work time doing, now I wasn't doing the same anymore, right? I was just coming to church and still involved, but in a different way.
Yeah. So then how did you guys both feel led to walk away from ministries and the churches you're involved in. And then how then did your paths cross? Or at what point did it start making, and I should probably 2 different questions here. There's that one. How did your paths cross? And then at what point did it start making sense why God pulled you out of where you were?
Almost immediately.
Oh.
When we started dating, because we saw the similarities, and we talked about where we were both at in our faith walk, and where we were at in our journey, and what we were hoping was next, but that we were both kind of on this treadmill, almost of just quiet waiting, which again was. So yeah, we knew almost immediately that God was setting us up. And just the way we met, and I mean, we met on eHarmony. Not that that's anything exciting, but there were all sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean that shared experience is, I think, something that early bonded us together, right? Because when you sit down at the table with somebody at your first date, right, and you start learning about each other, and they're like, "Well, I was involved in my church, and 2 years ago I kind of started pulling away," and then I'm scratching my head thinking, well, that sounds strangely familiar. Right? Tell me more about that. Right. So then you start having the conversation and peeling that back and understanding the similarities there. And so it gets your attention. Right. So because this experience was the same, I think for both of us, that grabbed our attention really quickly and gave us then another avenue to talk about what does that mean? Why do you think God's doing that? And really what's next? Right.
Yeah.
And during that time, we were doing a couple of different either Bible studies / counseling. Well, not at the first date, but not long after that. Either Bible study or counseling or reading. I have a long-term kind of email devotional, right? And those would, as you know, right, when you're involved with God, God speaks to you in so many different ways, right?
Yes.
And that was a clear one for us, that routinely this kind of situation would come back to us and be put right back in our lap and confirm for us that what was happening to us was something God had designed for us, not just something we decided to do on our own, but something that He had ordained already and was working through. So, but waiting was hard, Amy, like you said. That was one of the harder things, I think, for me during that period, is wondering, why are we doing this and what's next?
Yeah, I have to imagine there's a little bit of it that feels probably like, I'm thinking of like surgical processes when something is removed from us, that you hear about people who lose a limb and it feels like it's still there, and it takes a while for their body to recognize that it isn't. I have to imagine the waiting is hard because it's uncomfortable. You were in a spot, working in a thing. That happened to me here. I worked here for 9 years, and then I started dating my now wife, and we left for a season, and now we're back. But like that's a whole nother story. But I can definitely relate to the uprooting is kind of tough, because it feels less like, at that point, I felt less like a nudging of the Holy Spirit and more like I was being uprooted like a tree. And then the waiting then, in the year and a half it was for us before we came back here, and then the year leading up to, my stepping into this podcast, this is when for me it starts to go, okay, God, I see what you were doing, and why it wasn't a nudge, why it was more of a, I'm pulling you out to do something new. Because I was the worship director here, and I wouldn't be doing this if I was still doing that, which my wife is now doing. So that's just really, really cool to see. Like, the waiting part is, I don't know if we want to dive more into that or just name that for our listeners, that the waiting part is hard. You both have attested to, and I will agree. The waiting part is hard because it doesn't make sense until you're on the other side of it. In the sermon on Sunday, our pastor said something to the effect of, God's not looking for people to do things in human strength. He's looking for human surrender.
Yeah. Right.
And that convicted me hard to remember that in the times that I'm uncomfortable. Like, am I still surrendered when it doesn't make sense?
Right.
So you guys.
So then after we married about a year after we met. And so then the churches started bargaining with us. Well, you can worship here these days, and so it became pretty apparent very quickly that we needed to leave both, because we couldn't choose. I mean, it was impossible to choose between So then the next waiting process was to find a new church. So we visited multiple, and when we got to Grace, we were both pretty unanimous.
And so that's where I kind of want to dive in. And that was another part of the intro that you guys wrote that I found very interesting, was that it was one of the things that made you guys feel like this was the place to step into, was the church devotional that had been written at that time.
Yes.
And so dive into the importance of like shared stories in helping you guys become part of a new family, and really how has that helped your faith grow, just in being able to read other people's and hear other people's stories.
For me, I'll say this, I'm an introvert, right? So I struggle at meeting people and being open with them right away. And so coming to a new church where we were still grieving losing our old churches, right? That was a huge loss for us, is leaving your family church, right?
Yeah.
To come to a new church where you didn't know anybody or didn't know the culture or how it worked. So, and both of us came from small churches, right? So my church was 80 people and yours was, 100 or 120. But then coming to a really large church was a very different experience. But immediately then when we started reading that, it spoke to our hearts, because without even knowing the people, you could learn some of their stories, some of their faith journeys, and it helped then build layers and layers of relationship before you ever got to meet those people, right? Mm-hmm. Because it was a Bible-focused teaching tool or devotional tool, it allowed us to realize that this church was really connected solidly to a biblical foundation, right? Because that's what everybody was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you don't write a church devotional with your members if you don't trust their own connection to the Lord.
That's right.
To be able to write things that are, a blessing to everybody else who's going to read them.
Yeah,
and it's a vulnerable and brave thing to do for people to share their stories in a format that could go anywhere.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you guys about, to encourage our own listeners of the importance of sharing your story. I remember it's something we used to talk about with the high school students here. Like, how do you share your faith with other people, maybe who aren't church shopping, people who maybe don't even know about God at all? That there's all kinds of things we debate in our culture as to whether or not God is real, and where does evolution fit into all this, and what does spirituality look like? The one thing that no one can deny is your own story and your own experience and the things you've walked through and the things where you've seen God work. And just hearing your guys' story of walking with God and then God asking you to do something new, different, and uncomfortable, but then seeing his hand on it throughout the journey is as beneficial even for me, looking back on when God asked me to pull out and go, okay, yeah, so I'm not alone in that. That's really helpful to hear. All right.
It's an important shared conversation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't get to know somebody in the 10 minutes after church. Mm-hmm. Small groups are probably the best way, but at least a devotional and hearing someone's testimony, whether it's done in front of the church on Sunday morning or, they videotape it and share it. That's, you can't get better than that. People are sharing how they are joined to God, right? And an experience that they had with God. And that's so powerful.
Yeah.
You can't replicate that.
Absolutely not.
Learning other people's testimony and their personal story too. If you're in the Word, right, and you're understanding who the Bible characters are and what they experienced and what they were going through in their lives, and then you start to, apply that to your own life to look at, well, some of the things that I've done or not done or experienced or struggled with, right? It brings God's Word to life, to understand it in the context of your relationships with other people as well. Right. And people want to hear that. People want to know, right, that you're not some super Christian, right, that's got all the right answers and, Jesus, right? That's not the reality of our walk with God, especially in our world today, right? Where telling your story is not easy, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't always know how people are going to take it, right? Christians today, even, this is not new either, but sometimes we suffer because we tell our story and people marginalize us, make fun of us, don't believe us, put you in a certain box because Christians are in a box, right?
Right.
But that, to me, that telling your own personal experience with the Lord is one easy way to testify, right? I'm probably not going to argue with you about all the biblical dynamics and what's right and wrong and theologically most correct. I'll talk about it, but it's not where I'm going to start a conversation with you about my church experience, right? My faith experience.
Yeah, it's the personal things. And I think that's what our world needs most, in a world, even with the churches that get really big and then something happens, leadership makes a mistake, and then they crumble. And that's what the outside world sees.
That is what they see.
And then they see this inauthenticity. So to share our stories and our walk on a personal level, that's real and authentic and vulnerable, as you said, Amy, that I think is something that people crave. They want to know, is there something to this? And what does it look like to walk with Jesus?
And on the flip side of that, this is the other thing I'll say is because there were people in my life who maybe didn't even know me, that knew God, but didn't know me. And so when they had the opportunity to pour into me their story and go deeper with me and be vulnerable with me, that's where I got to grow too, right? Is by realizing, oh, wow, I don't have to have, a theology degree in order to be X kind of Christian. I can, I've watched this other person who's farther along than I am, and they're smart, and I value them and I trust them, and they're being vulnerable and telling me where they struggle, right, and where their faith has been shaken in the past. So maybe I could do the same thing for somebody else.
Ooh, that's really good. There was a couple of things in there that I was glad that you said, that we don't have to have a theology degree to do this. To talk to people about our faith or be open about our journey. And then again, hitting that vulnerable point is coming up a couple times now, that I find interesting what you just said, for people who are then maybe in a position where they are maybe mentoring or already talking or in a small group, being vulnerable to let people see behind the curtain, because that's the other thing, right? That would be being inauthentic, to try to keep up this facade of, I'm a good Christian, I've got this all together. Here's all the answers that you need for your walk. But instead to go, this is where I've learned, this is what I'm learning, this is how God has walked me through, but this is also where I still am. And these are the things that I'm still learning and struggling with.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because none of us are perfect, right? I don't care who you are. You mentioned the larger churches or ministries that fail because they're led by humans. Right?
Yes.
They're led by people who are not perfect, and they get a spotlight put on them. But in our own way, we all have a spotlight put on us, right? I mean, so we can choose to hide from that. And for me, probably I did that for a long time as an introvert, right? I didn't want to share all of my story. But at this point, I'm 55 years old, right? And I want more of God. And so you'll find often in my conversations with people, with men and women and people at church and people in the workplace, that I am being unnaturally vulnerable with people to tell them about my Christian experience. And I don't want to have the, how's the weather conversations with people all the time, right? I want to get real and understand who they are.
Right. And I think people, especially this is probably not a generational thing. To me, it feels like a generational thing, like millennials and all back and the newer generations coming up crave that authenticity. And that's probably true for everybody. We just have different ways of expressing it. My generation has expressed it by walking away from church.
Right.
We want the authenticity. We want people to be real. We've discovered we don't need the big lights and a show, and all that creates a great experience, but it doesn't create a walk with the Lord.
Yep.
Sharing our stories in community with one another, sharing where we're struggling, sharing where we're having breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. Their testimonies and sharing your story shares a little bit of your relationship with Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And at the core of it all, that's what this is all about, right? Is knowing who you are, who loves you, that you're worthy beyond compare, and sharing the stories where you've realized that in and amongst different problems. And I mean, that's super powerful. And I think that's how the devotional really hits well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it hits hard right at the heart of it. There's a lot of shame in this world. Sin is there, and you can't just walk up to somebody and give them some testimony that has nothing to do with what they're going through. So it does take love and the time and the questions, right? And the empathy and the compassion, and to get to know somebody enough.
Yeah.
And then you know what to share, right? I mean, you go to classes and you're like, how do you make your testimony? Or it's like, I got about 35,000 of them. So I'm not writing any of them down because God will give it to me as I'm sharing with this person, if it's even appropriate, right?
Right.
I mean, get to know them first and love them and pray for them. And if that's all you do, you're doing what you're supposed to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, because on the spiritual obedience it took to walk away from the churches you guys were in, it's the same spiritual obedience it takes to know when you're talking to someone what to share. Because we'd be very bad doctors if we prescribed cough medicine to someone with a broken bone, right? Like, if you don't ask questions, gosh, that's what I was just thinking about as you were talking, Amy. Like, there was a book I read at least part of. I am terrible at finishing books.
Nice honesty.
Yeah, thank you. That was the approach to like talking to people about Jesus, is just to ask questions about, just be interested, just listen, be interested in their life, be interested in what they're going through. And then I have found in being able to put that into practice a few times that you kind of see where you can offer little bits of Jesus and I offer little bits of my story and my walk and my experience, and just kind of let that sprinkle on there and let that enter into their thoughts and then see where it goes.
Yeah, you have to develop a relationship with them first.
Mm-hmm.
That's important. And people need that, to your point, right?
Right. Yeah.
They need it. If there's anything we crave today, I think it's people relationships. So
yeah.
If there's anything we crave, it's relationships with people. What an excellent point to wrap up our time here today. But before we go, I'd like to encourage you, dear listeners, to think of ways to share your story and people with whom you can share it. If you're not in a small group, join one. And if you are in a group, don't be afraid to make it bigger. Sharing life and sharing our stories has got to be one of the key ways that we can encourage one another in our walk of faith through a life of change and challenge. Let us conclude along those lines with Hebrews 10:24-25, which says, "Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works. And let us not neglect our meeting together, as some people do, but let us encourage one another, especially now that the day of Jesus' return is drawing near." Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this conversation has been a blessing to you and your walk with Jesus. Next episode, Mr. Jeff Chalfin will be joining us again as we talk about finding rest in Jesus through stress, anxiety, and uncertainty at work. If that sounds interesting to you, then we look forward to having you along for the discussion. New episodes of Equipped in Grace are posted every Wednesday at 8 a.m., so be sure to subscribe or follow this show on the podcast app of your choice to be notified of our latest content. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Bye-bye.